Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to discuss the importance of voting and civic engagement. My name is Vicki Kennedy, and I'm the co-founder and president of the board of directors of the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the United States Senate. I'm also very proud to be a member of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce board of directors, and I am thrilled to be opening this evening's very important and very timely program. Tonight's discussion is hosted by City Awake and the Kennedy Institute. City Awake, the Boston Chamber's young professional platform, empowers the next generation of leaders to engage in dialogue around the most important issues affecting our region. And with this election quickly approaching, and really having already started, it's imperative that we host conversations around the importance of civic engagement, especially for you, our next generation of leaders. That's an important part of the mission of the Kennedy Institute, and it is key to our newest initiative called Just Vote, a new permanent installation at the Kennedy Institute. I encourage you to go to justvote.org, where you can find an enormous amount of information about voting, about the importance of voting, about the history of voting, and we hope it will inspire you to get involved, to be even more active than you already are. Before I introduce today's absolutely incredible speakers, I want to point out that this webinar is being recorded and that it will be shared on the Chamber's YouTube page in the coming weeks. I also want to encourage you to utilize the chat and Q&A function during today's conversation. With that, I'm proud to introduce the moderator for today's program. Courtney Caruso is a senior associate in the Investigations, White Collar, and Fraud Department at Hogan Lovells. Courtney's practice focuses on criminal defense, government enforcement actions, and internal investigations. She held the position of chair of the Massachusetts Generation Citizen Associate Board, an organization that teaches thousands of students nationwide to actively participate in their democracy through local action civics projects. Welcome, Courtney. Courtney will be speaking this evening with our very special guest, and I am so pleased to introduce my dear friend and newest member of the Kennedy Institute Board of Directors, tonight's featured speaker, Martin Luther King III. The oldest son of the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Mrs. Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King III certainly has seized the torch lit by his parents by continuing their quest for equality and justice for all. Mr. King has dedicated his life to promoting civil rights and global human rights, and to eradicating the triple evils of racism, militarism, and poverty, all of which his father identified as the scourges of humankind. As the founder and president of Realizing the Dream, Mr. King has spearheaded nonviolence training in Bosnia-Herzegovina, India, Israel, and Palestine, Kenya, Sri Lanka, and the United States. He also serves on the board of directors for the Drum Major Institute for Public Policy in New York, which is a nonprofit education and community advocacy think tank. And in 2011, along with Ambassador Andrew Young and others, Mr. King co-founded Bounce TV, the first independently owned digital multicast network featuring 24/7 programming geared toward African Americans. I could go on because his life has been always involved in what Oliver Wendell Holmes called the action and passion of our times. He is an extraordinary human being, and it is truly an honor to have him with us this evening. So on behalf of all of us here at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute, City Awake, and the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, thank all of you in this webinar who are participating. Thank you for joining us. And Courtney, I'll now pass it on to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Kennedy, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Mr. King, for taking the time to sit with us this afternoon. I think you are still, oh, there you are. Hello, welcome. Good to see you. So I know that I and all of our participants are very much looking forward to hearing from you today and to learning from you and to just gaining a little bit of the wisdom that you have to share with us. So I'd like to jump right in and talk about 2020, which has, as we all know, felt insurmountable for all of us, as if it's just one never ending and continuous breaking news story. We have and we continue to confront multiple crises at one time, from the COVID-19 pandemic to the enduring fight for racial justice, and in now just 2 weeks and currently ongoing, a pivotal election that has already been fraught with efforts to suppress votes and even suppress voter turnout. So, as a global human rights activist, can you tell us a little bit about what your vision is for how we can best take on the task of confronting and conquering these crises, and what you think the role of young people is in that process?
Certainly. Thank you so much for the question and for the opportunity. And certainly I want to thank Ms. Vicki Kennedy and the Kennedy Institute, and honored to actually be a member of the board, a new member. This is a very interesting time in the United States and the world. And what is probably most interesting to me is that you've had a confluence of several movements that sort of have emerged together. Perhaps the height would have been at the very tragic death of George Floyd that we all got to see, interestingly enough, because there was a pandemic. And so many people were at home, and the pandemic, of course, still going on, unfortunately. But I would say before that, if we go back and look at the elections of 2018, and even a tiny bit before that, Black Lives Matter certainly has existed for a number of years now. But in 2018, I think that 3 organizations at a minimum were involved to help determine an election outcome. And those organizations or those entities, Black Lives Matter really is not an organization, but it's an entity. But I think you have the women's movement, or the Me Too movement, Black Lives Matter, and you had the Parkland students who tragically, many of them lost a lot of their friends in a tragic shooting just a few years back. But these different entities, which largely is comprised of a lot of young people, came together and they helped to elect different people in the United States House of Representatives, and then a number of pieces of legislation that represent moving forward were passed. Some legislation around gun control, legislation most recently around the George Floyd Policing Act. And because of voter suppression, there is a bill in Congress that passed that's named in honor of the late, great John Lewis, who we lost this year, also who devoted his life to making sure that we all would have the right to vote, and put his personal body on the line because he was beaten many times, but certainly beaten on that very first day of Bloody Sunday in March of 1965, attempting to march over the Edmund Pettus Bridge with about 600 people. But he and Reverend Hosea Williams, who was one of my father's lieutenants, were the leaders of that march, and it did not happen. But my higher point is there is a bill in Congress named in honor of John Lewis, the Voter Registration Restoration Act, John Lewis Restoration Act. Those have passed. They have not even been attempted to be listened to in the United States Senate. And that really goes to show why elections matter. We all know that we're in a very critical election for the United States of America. And who we choose will determine whether our nation chooses to move forward or whether we attempt to go backward. And so I'm very, quite frankly, optimistic about where we potentially can go. And I'm totally inspired by the young people, particularly the young people at Parkland, who built a coalition of young people all across America. And I think that coalition is growing. And again, I say, you know, the George Floyd tragic death galvanized and mobilized millions of people, not just in the United States, but all over the world. We saw demonstrations. Civil and human rights demonstrations in every state in the United States. That's never happened, by the way. And we saw demonstrations in Europe and in Australia and on the African continent and in South America. So the whole world was focused for that period of time. That energy is, although some may say it's dissipated, it's not going anywhere. People are standing up for justice and righteousness, and to be, to be recognized. And I think that we are going to, I think that we've got to find a constructive way to deal with these issues, not a destructive, not a violent way. That never really yields permanent solutions. But, I believe that through the philosophy of nonviolence that my father articulated and embraced and used and attempted to show our nation, is how we bring about lasting change. So as I said, I'm certainly very concerned about what we are seeing in our own country right now, the division and divisiveness that exists. But I'm hopeful that I know that we will get through this period, but we need everyone to participate. We don't have a vote to leave behind. And my dad used to say that a voteless people is a powerless people. And one of the most important steps that we can take is that short step to the ballot box.
Well, one of the really interesting things that you're touching on here is also the idea that many of these movements are years in the making. When we think about Parkland and the women's movement and Black Lives Matter, I mean, they've been laying the grassroots organization brick by brick by brick. And then, after years and years of work, you have these flashpoints, which I think we entered with George Floyd's death, in which all of immense progress is made in this short period of time. And one of the things I've been thinking about is how we take this flashpoint, this moment in time, and apply it not just to the national conversation, but to local politics, because our local politics and our local policies can affect so much of our lives, from our clean air, water, food, policing, housing, systemic racism, transportation, you name it. So how do we think about the importance of local politics in starting small and starting local and in doing incremental change that we can then bring to a national scale? And for people who have maybe been paying more attention to the national story and less to their local politics, is there any advice you offer about why it's important to focus on not just what's happening nationally, but what's going on just around us in our own communities?
Yes, well, first of all, every election matters. And no matter what level it is, every election to me matters. Now, I think one of the things that is so critically important is I would like to encourage young people, not necessarily in this election cycle, because it's obviously in full bloom all over our country. We've had over 22 million people who have voted already. And it is probably the largest pre-turnout ever in our history. And hopefully those numbers will continue so that we have a significant level of participation. And why I'm thinking about participation, let me mention this, that out of 170 democracies around the world, the United States votes at about 139. So 138 countries voted higher levels than us. So we purport and believe that we are a great democracy, but until we're truly participating at maximum levels, I would question how great we really are. I know we can become great, but I don't think we've achieved that ultimate greatness until more of us are participating. So I want to start by saying that. Secondly, I wanted to talk about getting young people involved as elected officials. Now, if you think about the fact that a young person who goes to college, and when he or she graduates, if you're in the ROTC, you become a lieutenant at your senior level, and you're actually in the military leading troops. You have a platoon of 20 to 25 soldiers who are actually in your command. So if you can lead at 21 in the military, why then can you not run for city council? Why not school board? Why not state legislative officer? And in some cases, mayors, because many of our small cities, many of those jobs are part-time jobs. And so if we want to get more young people involved in the process, I think that more young people need to offer themselves for office. And of course, sometimes it starts at various levels. Maybe it's volunteering to initially to put out campaign signs. Maybe it's studying to learn various policies and to go and knock on doors to talk to people about what you would like to implement so that you can get support, ultimately graduating from starting off to just putting up signs or volunteering for a campaign to ultimately, in a very short period of time, maybe running for office. We need far more young people involved, and just as we need more women in office at all levels. And I think that is slowly happening. So I'm very excited about that. But you know, the reality is every decision that a mayor or a council person or a county commissioner or judges or a sheriff or a solicitor, or the list goes on and on. They all impact our lives. That's why it's so important to not to be engaged at all levels. You know, when you think about something like land use, zoning issues, elected officials decide whether or not something will be residential or commercial. You live in a neighborhood, and all of a sudden your neighborhood starts transitioning, and that's not what you wanted. But if you didn't vote, you know, maybe you didn't realize that these decisions are made by people who represent you and represent us. So these are some of the reasons why it's so critically important to participate at all levels, because elected officials make those decisions. And basically, you know, we all pay taxes. And so tax monies are divided. Elected officials just decide how they're going to use our tax monies to provide services for our communities. So they're really, I mean, those are some of the important reasons why we should participate at all levels.
Yeah, that's such a good point. I know that I often attend I live in downtown Boston. I often attend our local community meetings. And when I started going a few years ago, I was very hesitant to speak up, but I found myself compelled to, because it seemed like there was really no one who had my perspective. It was a very small section of the neighborhood that attended the meetings, and they kind of dominated the meetings, and their perspective became the neighborhood's perspective. And you realize that when you don't participate, when you don't show up, you lose your voice, when really just one comment, just one opinion that is a different one could change the narrative and could change the influence for your whole community. So what do you think are some of the reasons why young people don't vote at higher rates? I saw something that said from the Pew Research Center study that in 2016, baby boomers accounted for 43% of eligible voters, but cast 49% of the ballots. So now, as we're looking to this election, It looks like millennials and members of Generation Z comprise about 40% of eligible voters. So what do you think are the barriers, both systemic or specific to specific regions, that sometimes prevent young people from voting, that we could all be aware of and more conscious of?
You know, I think that historically, we have made it somewhat difficult to vote. And even now, when you talk about voter suppression, for example, you know, I think comedian Chris Rock said it best: if you want to have a big party to celebrate something, would you have it on Tuesday? And the reality is probably not.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, we have historically had elections on Tuesday, but there's no real reason why that has to be the case. We could actually have elections on the weekend. We could even designate another holiday to have elections if that's what we chose. But we have to make this very important as a society. And yes, it's good we have early voting. That's great. It's good that you know, you can vote by mail because of the pandemic, even though we're concerned as to what really is going to happen because of what is coming out of the White House. I think many are concerned, and that's why people are willing to stand in lines and vote, because they believe that this is such a critical election. But I think young people, historically, just because we have not put enough emphasis on the importance of voting, I think that, you know, we sort of teach it a little bit in schools, but there is a group of the population that feels that it really doesn't matter because, you know, my vote doesn't change anything. I'm just one person, so maybe I won't go. I don't want to make that sacrifice to have to stand in line. I think that there are a lot of little excuses. Then there may be even the excuse that, well, what about the intimidation factor? In other words, I'm afraid, I've never voted, so I don't know. This process seems overwhelming, although it's very simple. Sometimes the amendments that we vote on are complicated. And so it seems to me one of the ways we address this is, as a society, when I was growing up, we used to have something called voter education project. So, you know, just assuming that somebody is going to register and vote, that's not the answer. Yes, you always want to be engaged in registration, but you need voter education with voter registration that will create, I believe, high levels of voter participation. So a voter education concept, how that manifests itself today, I haven't focused on that, but I do believe that it's in order to have voter education along with registration, and that will hopefully create a higher level participation. Now, this election might generate more levels of support than we've ever seen. And the question is, you know, how do we sustain that if that becomes the case? And, you know, I think we'll be looking at this election for a period of time because, you know, what has happened is, again, at the national level, there seems to have been a desire to keep people divided. And I think people might be very frustrated with that process. Most people want to be able to go about their lives and with as little conflict as possible. And unfortunately, the way the leadership, some of the leadership at the national level is bringing out all kind of things that seem and feel disruptive and destructive. And the human spirit, human beings want to live. People don't want to give up and die. And unfortunately, in chaos, all kinds of unfortunate things can happen. So I would like to believe that most people want to get us out of chaos. How do we get out of chaos? And that might be one, you know, if a large turnout comes out, I'm sure that that's going to be one of the reasons that we have this massive turnout. It looks that way early, that we are going to have certainly a larger turnout than we've ever had. But I think we will continue to evaluate that. But I also think that, the thing that I've never seen this much of an emphasis put on voting. I mean, when you go to the automated teller machine, I don't remember something saying vote. Have you voted? Not telling you who to vote for. It's nonpartisan, and I think that's very interesting. So there's a consciousness today that probably is helping enlighten all of us, and to see all of these different forces just encouraging people to vote, in my judgment, is very positive, and ultimately, will help to establish and let us truly understand that democracy does work. There are critical decisions around healthcare that are going to come up, and so many other issues, climate change, that I think many people are concerned about, and that's what I think these last 4 years have shown us more than anything, is that elections matter. Many people are coming to that conclusion, or at least more than ever have, that maybe, I should have voted. I feel bad that I didn't, because I didn't expect things to deviate into where we are. And this is not, none of us could have controlled the pandemic. I don't think the issue is the pandemic. The pandemic is a part of it, but it's not the pandemic, but how the pandemic has or has not been managed. And, people dying and numbers going up every day. So we have to evaluate, did we really handle this properly? Was it handled at the national level properly? And, many people would probably say no. So I think there are a number of factors. When we talk about systemic racism that exists, systematically throughout our nation, I think people always knew that racism existed, but there's something about the tragedy of George Floyd that all of a sudden people really begin to say, oh my gosh, we are not where we thought we were. And we need to take heed and do something to make the nation what it ought to be for all citizens.
When you talk about this national consciousness around voting, I've been wondering if it is at all connected to employers and companies more willing to step into this space. I know that my company actually gave us the day off this year for Election Day, and I have been advocating for that for a long time, but had never seen it before. And for so long, we have so many people here connected to the Chamber of Commerce who come from industries all around Boston. And for as long as I can remember, the conventional wisdom has been, leave politics out of the office. It's not for conversation around the water cooler. But ever since COVID, since the death of George Floyd, you see more and more employers and companies stepping into this space. They're willing to have this conversation. And so now I'm wondering, what do you think the role is for companies and employers, even corporate America, so to speak, in moving us forward and allowing their employees to engage on these issues in the workplace, even though they're, political and things that typically have been frowned upon, let's say, as workplace discussions.
So I think that's an individual the choice in terms of what you talk about. I think it's very important for corporations to give people the day off or to encourage people to vote. I think that's great. In terms of the dialogue that exists, that's a different discussion, because it can become very personal and very heated. And, I think every corporation has to make their decisions themselves. And it really is not, again, about trying to encourage someone to vote one way or another. Although I think corporations have always taken various positions. We see it all the time, where we see these corporations who encourage their workers or their workforce or their leaders to to come to fundraisers for various candidates. Again, that's a personal choice. I don't think that public companies should engage necessarily that way. I think every company should encourage people to vote, and every company or many should do more of what we see this year, which is corporations offering, like I think Uber and Lyft are providing rides to the poll. I mean, there's a whole lot going on that we've never seen. I think that's all very positive. I just think that when you get to personalizing an issues, now, of course, if it is your company, meaning an individual private company, he or she, certainly can do whatever they choose, and actually, if you want to encourage your workforce to go in a direction, I think that's appropriate. But I think, first of all, we have to find things that we can, sort of agree on. All of us can agree on. And the problem is today is that I think we've become so divided that it's going to take some force to bring us back together and to get us to invest in what is really in the best interest of the whole. When I was growing up, you used to say there was a saying, the good politician plans for the next election, the statesperson plans for the next generation. And so we need more statesperson kind of thought leaders, because it really is about how do we plan for everyone? What is in the best interest? There may be individual decisions, for example, I don't want to say it's a foregone conclusion, but it looks like the United States Supreme Court is going to become significantly conservative, a significant majority of conservative. And, what does that mean? And none of us really know that. We only know that from an ideological standpoint, those members who've been appointed have personified very, very extremely conservative values. And how does that serve our whole society for the next 50 years? And none of us know that answer. But again, it goes back to the point, elections matter. Because while someone was thinking this doesn't really affect me, but yet a position, and I guess my personality, I'm just talking about me, Martin, is more balanced. I don't, I'm not against anyone. But I hope that we have balance as opposed to one extreme one way or one extreme the other. And every now and then we have to go through these extremes so that we can move forward. And so it's going to be interesting to see how the courts address the issue of whether it's, a woman's right, women's protective right, reproductive rights, whether it's, healthcare, whether it's issues around, voting suppression, because we've seen the court take positions around voter suppression that, as opposed to taking positions that say we need to make it easier for everyone to participate. We don't need to put up any barriers. We need no restrictions. The state of Florida, as an example, most recently, 2 years ago, they voted so that felons could vote once they've served their time. But then they came up with another provision that said that if you owe the state money, you still cannot vote. That's almost like putting a poll tax on. I mean, you've served your time, been incarcerated, and no one is getting jobs now much. In fact, the jobs are being lost. I mean, we've seen millions of people thrust because of the pandemic into impoverished conditions. And yet a survey came out just the other day that talked about 8 more million people are put into poverty. And yet on this issue, where you're saying you need to pay your debt to society, and it's impractical for that to even be the case. But this is what state officials in Florida have chosen to do. And, there was some assistance by some very philanthropic minded people. I know Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York. I think there were a couple of entertainers as well who raised a significant amount of money dedicated to pay off those debts. But I don't know what happened after that, because Florida said they were going to investigate to see if that was illegal. I mean, it's almost, how do you have people in 2020 putting barriers in place to stop people from participating in their democratic right? And yet, you know, that's where we are. So we got to figure out how to bring the nation together so we can all begin to agree. It doesn't mean, I mean, I think my father showed us how we can disagree without being disagreeable. And we almost need some of that in the mainstream dialogue today, for us to figure out how do we move forward, because we don't need to go backward. It does not mean that there may not be things that we look at in the past and say, well, those are some things we need to preserve and maintain. But it really is about how do we move forward as a collective unit, as a nation. You know, articles are coming out that talk about the lack of respect for the United States around the world. That we should have never deviated into this hole that we seem to be in right now. And hopefully those kind of things are enough amounts of information that cause people to vote and say, we want something different than what we've seen the last 4 years.
So when we think about looking at those failures of our institutions, sometimes I worry that people will feel like the failures are too great, that it's just a lost cause. You know, what can we do about it? And recently at City Awake and the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce hosted a 5-day festival. It was called The Fierce Urgency of Now. The festival centered the experiences and challenges and opportunities of young people of color in and around Boston. And so, of course, the Fierce Urgency of Now title is derived directly from some of your father's speeches, which emphasize the importance of taking action and not waiting for future generations to make the change for us. You know, it's for us to make that change. And during that festival's closing ceremony, the moderator was speaking with Dr. Ibram Kendi about a fear that Generation Z in particular, and young people in particular, have this overwhelming sense that the institutions around them have failed them and continue to fail them. And so the question she posed to Dr. Kendi that I'd also like to ask you now is, how can we help restore faith in our social institutions for the next generation? And how can a faithful pursuit of anti-racist policies help in that process?
So again, I think that the institutions, I mean, there are a couple of ways that this has to happen. And part of it is we have to really look hard at existing policy to see where it has worked or has not worked. And then we have to create new policy, and elected officials have to, you know, pass those policies. Because what has failed, there are institutions that have failed or have not heard or listened to what the needs are of the community. But there's also policy that just sits out here that is never executed. So I think that if people felt that, okay, these policies are working to help transform the community, then their faith is renewed. But again, some of this is just almost the kind of leadership that we elect at all these different levels. And I think that, you know, newer and newer leadership is going to push the envelope so that maybe more faith can be restored. And around the issue of racism, I mean, there's so much from sensitivity to human relations to, you know, to diversity, that, you know, really probably should be advanced in a school system between K to 12 and really into college. If we taught young people diversity, sensitivity, human relations in kindergarten, all the way up through high school and in college, we would, we could end systematic racism in a very short period of time. The fact of the matter is, if you have no exposure, no understanding, unconscious bias exists all the time. And that doesn't mean a person is just a racist. He or she, that's why it's called unconscious. You're not even aware of it because you're not exposed. And until when you're, it's almost the old saying, when you know better, you do better. And so if one is trained to have sensitivity to other cultures, including, and most importantly, the indigenous population that was here before any of us got here, which we call Indians or Native Americans. It has to start there. And, when we start treating everyone with dignity and respect, which is part of what my father and others have advocated, it's about the dignity and worth of every human being, because every human being is important. But if you're not taught that, if you're not told that, if you don't embrace that, you never know, and you may not ever achieve your full status or objective. So I think that there are a lot of things that we can do, but it really does start with who are our leaders. And it doesn't have to just be in politics, by the way. We need leadership in community. We need in communities. We need leadership in our religious institutions. We need and there are a number of these innovative young executives who are doing a great job. There are a number of bipartisan organizations that are young legislators who are Democrat and Republican, and they're working together far better than what we see at the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate. And we've got to find ways to highlight more of that, because when people see models of things that work, they want to engage. And when it's positive as opposed to negative, we've been inundated with so much negative, just like, this has nothing to do with politics per se, but I think we have created and accepted a culture of violence. And I believe we've got to create a culture of nonviolence. Because when we operate at higher levels, at an optimum level, we, as I said, when you know better, you do better. And, people may say, well, that doesn't seem right. But, if you have a commander in chief who is saying it's all right to go out and fight people, literally, because you disagree with them, that's unheard of. And that's just, it's not a civil way of resolving conflict. I mean, if the old adage of an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth worked, most of us wouldn't have eyes or teeth. So clearly that can't be the methodology that we use to advance society. And, there's been talk in this election about some of the ultra right-wing militia groups engaging in violence, but there's probably talk on the other side in violence too. I mean, that is not going to serve our society well. As I said, cooler heads prevail. And we've got to find a way to create a cooler headedness in this nation so that we can address these very difficult issues. The pandemic, which is, the numbers are growing every day by the thousands, and that's very frightening. The issues around racial intolerance, those issues, and particularly around policing, are still happening every week. So we got to find ways to address these issues so that our nation doesn't become a powder keg and we end up imploding. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's going to happen. I'm just saying that that's a possibility if we go down these roads. We need to go down different roads to talk about how do we sustain our nation? How do we sustain the environment? These are very real issues that have not been addressed in the last 4 years, not really at least not by the government or the federal government in the last 4 years. So, and these are critical to our survival. If our water and our air is gone, we might as well give it up. It's for naught. So these are issues that we as human beings can address when we choose to come together.
I've heard this theme of what you're saying about education here too, both on the sense of sensitivity and anti-discrimination, anti-racism, and in the sense of voter education, civic engagement. There's an organization that is near and dear to my heart called Generation Citizen that is exclusively focused on action civics. It's this idea that you have to actually teach people how to participate in democracy. It's not that you can watch, a bill on Capitol Hill, the old schoolhouse rock, and just know how to participate in democracy. We actually have to learn by doing. And they also do an initiative called Beyond the Ballot, which talks about all of the ways that we can get involved in our democracy beyond just voting, because even though voting is so critical and we all must do it, we should do more than that. I mean, there's lots of ways to engage. So when we're thinking about education, the one thing that's tricky is that it feels like education around these issues always seems to be the first thing that's cut when we're talking about budgets. And even in Massachusetts, we have the Civic Trust Fund, which is supposed to be funding these action civics projects that are now required for Massachusetts students. But again, there's a question of how are you going to fund it? Where's the money going to come from? And when you have a pandemic and lots of things you need to cut, that seems to be the first issue that people are willing to say, well, maybe next year we can do that project. So how do we center education in both civic engagement and voting, in our own humanity and connecting with each other and identifying racism in our communities as part of a central tenet of education, as opposed to the extracurricular activity that always seems to get pushed to the side? Do you have any ideas about that?
Again, it goes back to who's leading, because the priorities are determined by what the community accepts or doesn't accept. So when the people understand that we are the power, and use our power effectively, then the issues are prioritized. That's a great example, because I believe we need conflict resolution taught in schools. It used to be, but it was one of the first things cut. I'm like, you don't see the trends of violence going up and conflict going up, and yet you don't think that's important, that we have an alternative method to resolve conflict that does not lead to violence, but you have to teach people how to do that, because you can't assume they automatically know. And yet, as you say, the arts programs, all kinds of things that can give outlets. And the bottom line is, I don't believe there is a lack of resources for us to do whatever we need to do. I think there has not been the will. There's the ability as well as the resources. I mean, we live in a multi-trillion-dollar nation. I mean, trillions of dollars. Now, when Andrew Yang was talking about providing, an annual income of some kind, which he says he borrowed, of course, from something my father talked about many years ago, over 52 years ago. Dad was talking about a guaranteed annual income. But, interestingly enough, all of a sudden during the pandemic, we were able to come up with, $1,200 to give every family. And we did it twice, and it should have been done again, because people are still suffering. Now, does that mean we will have all this debt? Maybe temporarily. But, when you think about the fact that those who are billionaires, during a time when everybody has, or many are losing things, jobs are being cut, businesses are going out, all these people are making 300 or 400 times more money. So there's got to be a different level of consciousness that says, okay, we can dedicate some of this to addressing some of these issues. That's why I say that it's not a shortage of resources. That's what we are told often. It really is a shortage of insightfulness. And when different leaders come to the table, we will get different results. Again, I can't say enough why elections matter. Every election matters, because who we choose to represent us is going to determine how resources come into our communities and impact us at all levels of education. I mean, you know, I don't want to be negative, but I was thinking about my own city of Atlanta. Boston perhaps is slightly different, but you know, all cities have some challenges around some urban issues, and education, in terms of urban education, oftentimes is abysmal. Now, just in Atlanta, we have 12 or 15 Fortune 500 corporations. Those corporations alone could make sure that there's no resource need, whether it is money or whether it's human resource. It's in their best interest. Atlanta should have one of the best school systems in the nation, and 100 cities around this country. I could see if we were in the rural areas and there just were not the kind of support that was needed in a rural area, but that's not the case. But yet all of our cities have poor urban education. Why is that? And why is that not a priority? And again, elections matter. Elected officials make some of these decisions. But the fact of the matter is, it's going to take the whole community. It's going to take corporations participating with the community and providing resources, dollars, as well as human resources. It's in their interest to help create a workforce. Although everything is moving toward technology, if you have the best system of education, you're going to produce the best young people who at some point will be working perhaps for your corporation. So it makes no sense. In the United States, we're not a third world developing country. We are just a nation with phenomenal abundance, but it is how the abundance has been used. It has not been used in an appropriate way. And so it takes leadership to challenge, not to destructively criticize, but maybe constructively saying, okay, let's do this in a different way. And it's not one person, it is many who are working together on this mission that will help address these issues in whether it's Boston, whether it's Atlanta, whether it's throughout our nation. They are not issues that cannot be resolved. My dad and mom used to say it only takes a few good women and men to bring about change. And we need to continue to create the climate to prepare these young women and men to help bring about this change.
Well, so as we wrap up here, I've been integrating some of the questions from the chat, but there's one that came in that I think would be a good wrap up question that's really looking at how we can feel empowered and optimistic about the future. So this person asks, how do we instill in the youth and in older adults as well that the only thing that moves hate is love? The current administration has overly practiced divide and conquer. How do we not allow any person, place, or thing or idea to separate us?
Wow, that's a very good.
Yeah, great
good
question. I thought maybe a great kind of way for us to end on a great note of optimism and the power we have that we can harness and move forward with.
You know, the way that I see it is that all of us are not going to be able to create monumental change. And if we exhibit and emanate love, then we generally are going to get love back. That sounds very simple, but or it sounds like, okay, well, how do you do that? I mean, every day I try to exhibit a spirit of love, and I say that because, you know, I could be very bitter. My dad was killed at 10 years old. My father's brother drowned mysteriously a year later. My grandmother was killed at 16, both of them gunned down by assassin's bullets. My father by a white man, my grandmother by a black man. So I could have chosen to embrace hatred. But I was thankful for examples. An example of my grandfather and my mother and my aunts and uncles who brought me up in an environment of love that taught me to dislike the evil act, but still love the individual. And so I had to learn to forgive. We don't know how to forgive. As I said, if someone does something to us, we're going to get them back. And so we've got to sort of change a little bit of who we are. And it's going to take time. It's not something that happens overnight, but in time, we must be the change that we want to seek. In other words, as Gandhi said, be the change. And, you know, my wife often says, we must, oh gosh, I'm having a senior moment. I've forgotten the quote. But let me say it this way, because this is another way that I think many can participate in. When I was a child, my mom took me to an undergraduate institution, which was Antioch College. And on the college, there's a statue of the educator Horace Mann. And under that statue is an inscription that says, "Be ashamed to die until you've won a victory for humanity." So, you know, that sounds huge because at 14, when I first saw it, I was like, wow, that's very powerful. How do you do that? And so I had to break it down to victories. And I said, you know, we can win a victory on our street. We can win a victory in our neighborhood. We can win victories in our schools or in our places of worship. Some of us will win victories in our city. Some may win victories in our state. Some may win victories in our nation. And some, better yet, may win victories for our world. But all those words basically mean are be ashamed to die until you've done a little something to make the world in which we all must live a little better than it was when you arrived. So all of us can engage in a positive way and by winning little victory. It doesn't have to be a large victory. Yes, those who can, a corporation could obviously win a large victory, or a foundation, but individuals can too. I mean, we look at these young people like young Greta on climate change, or Malawi, who's in Pakistan. I mean, young people are doing it all the time, and it just takes theirs have been magnified in a huge way, but it's their voices, it's their actions. So we all can take little small steps to make the whole better, make the community, the nation, and the world better.
I think those are perfect words to end on. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. I'm so grateful for having you. I think we all learned so much and are going to take this with us through the next 2 weeks and well beyond that. Thank you all to all of our audience members who joined us as well. If you're interested in attending more discussions, you should head over to cityawake.org or follow City Awake on social media. And you'll learn more about all kinds of interesting conversations going on pertaining to Boston and beyond. And of course, big thanks to our sponsors tonight, the Barr Foundation, John Hancock, P&G Gillette, and of course, Vicki Kennedy and the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for supporting us and bringing us all here to have this great conversation. So thank you again, and I hope everyone has a great night.
Thank you.
All right.